Greetings. Today you'll see me on the left side over here at the moment because of the orientation of this particular graph. The topic we're going to address today is how India was never really a high growth economy. It was a moderate growth economy for certain periods of time, and it was a low growth economy for other periods of time. It was never really a high growth economy, and this is designed to puncture the myth that that was ever truly the case. Now, if you've seen other videos of mine, I have a video over here about how the BRIC countries, BRIC countries, was a very artificial narrative that had no basis in fact. And I have other videos about India's growth in relation to China that I will cite later on in this particular video. But today we're going to look at the evidence of whether India was ever a high growth economy or not. So we take this first chart from Google, which is updated through 2018 data. I'm not sure why they haven't updated after that. Over here it says last updated April 8th, 2020 for 2018 data. So they should have 2019 data, but they don't. That's fine. And this is GDP per capita in current US dollars. So not adjusting for inflation, the actual GDP in the dollars of the year in question. The horizontal axis is the years measure from 1960 all the way to 2018. And the important thing, pay attention here, the vertical axis is GDP per capita, but on a logarithmic scale. There's a reason we take the logarithmic scale because the proportional distance between the lines can be seen in a geometric sense, and therefore any widening or narrowing of this distance is much easier to observe. Okay? So in 1960, India had a per capita GDP that was a certain gap from the world average, and the world average was a certain gap from the United States. And the world obviously contained both India and the United States, as well as every other country. So this was the gap in 1960. As we progress through the decades, you can see in the 1990s, which a lot of Indians think was a time when some major economic growth started, the truth was quite the opposite, in fact. This is when India was the furthest behind the world average and the furthest behind the United States in the 1990s and early 2000s. It was falling further and further behind. And then after that point, starting from about 2002, there was some catch-up for a few years, but even that has been flatlining ever since. So other than this one spurt, there was never any real phase of sustained structural high growth. And lo and behold, in 2018, the gap between India and the rest of the world, and between the world and the United States, is about the same as in 1960. These lines have not changed their rankings substantially at all. The status quo has persisted, and India has only reverted back to the relative prosperity level that it had in 1960 in relation to the rest of the world and to the United States. So this does not look like a high growth economy when it is no closer to the world average than it was 60 years prior, and no closer to the United States than it was almost 60 years prior either. So that already punctures the myth that India has ever been some high growth economy. Whatever recent rapid growth occurred was only to get it back to where its natural steady state was meant to be. Now, the reason I have to address this is a lot of Indians are very over the top in bragging about how quickly India is growing as an economy and how it's already an advanced economy, which is absolutely not the truth. And when Indians very vocally say these patently ignorant things, there is an expected and deserved blowback from that. But unfortunately, that comes to me as well, even though I'm not the perpetuator of that myth, nor do I live in India, nor was I born in India. But I do have to create this video to set the record straight about whether India was ever really a high-growth economy or not. Now, unfortunately, a video like this is also going to encourage the other side. There's a lot of people who are very racist who want to say, well, India just doesn't have the intellectual power or the genetics of people in India as well as sub-Saharan Africa are inadequate to ever become prosperous countries. That's not true either. We are in an era of an accelerating rate of economic growth, and the absolute growth rate can be high even when there is not a relative catch-up. But nonetheless, the topic of this video is proven pretty substantially just from this chart, but we're going to provide some other material as well. So I go to this other metric, which is the list of countries by Human Development Index. So this goes beyond GDP per capita and looks at other metrics of human development, such as education, infant mortality, life expectancy, and so forth, many of which correlate to GDP per capita, but not exactly. So India has a ranking of about 131 out of all the countries in the world. How many countries in the world are there? About 189 countries. India is number 131 out of 189, which is about the same ranking it has had for the last 60 years. How can an economy that is supposedly having high growth still be ranked as low as number 131 and still have the same ranking that it had for at least the last 30 years, let's say? Well, that's because the countries of similar rank as India are also growing at the same rate, effectively. So India's ranking just does not improve. It is improving in absolute terms. Remember, other videos on this channel of mine indicate how a country that is ranked 131 today would have been ranked about 40 in 1980, because the entire world economy has grown. But in terms of relative growth among countries, no, India is not a high-growth economy if its ranking is not improving at all. That is basic mathematical logic. And then we go to the third metric, which is balance of trade. These links will all be in the description box below. So we see trade balance percentage of GDP 2020. China has a positive trade balance, 3.63% of GDP. That means it is exporting more than it imports by an amount that equals to 3.63% of its GDP in 2020. That is good. It has a trade surplus, which is what a country wants to have, because that has a bunch of other multiplier effects within that country. Now let's look at India. Oh, almost the same number, 3.62%. Oh, but wait a minute. There's a negative sign. Minus 3.62%. That means India imports more than it exports by an amount of 3.62% of its GDP. And this is a very negative effect on the economy because a trade deficit has a number of negative multiplier effects as well. Now, China and India both import a lot of oil, and the U.S. fracking revolution, which lowered the price of oil, has done a lot to reduce the imports of both countries, and both should have moved towards a more positive balance of trade. But China was able to do that more effectively, and India could not. India could only get a tailwind of 1 or 2 years from this one-time boom of lower oil prices, and then quickly reverted back to lower GDP growth because it cannot produce enough products that the rest of the world wants to buy to an extent that it can reduce India's imports of oil. Now, other technological revolutions will also give India small temporary boosts, such as electric cars and photovoltaics in particular, because India is one of the leaders of photovoltaic technology implementation, partly because of its favorable latitude for solar power. And then that solar electricity can power the electric cars that Indians will eventually buy from that and reduce oil imports. But even these are just small temporary boosts. India is not able to create any structural growth above that moderate growth rate that it kind of cruises at, which is underwhelming, and its ranking in terms of Human Development Index is not going to improve anytime soon. By the way, the United States has a trade deficit that is minus 4.67% of its GDP. But an advanced economy can absorb that more easily than a poor country like India for reasons I have described in other videos as well. The huge gap of plus 3.63% for China versus minus 3.62% for India effectively explains the huge divergence in economic growth rates of the two countries, even though China was poorer than India as recently as 1993. As recently as 1993, China was behind India in per capita GDP. Now it's very far ahead. It's about 5 times as high as India in per capita GDP. And I have another video over here, which you should look at, which explains how India no longer has any chance of catching up to China, even though India was ahead of China not all that long ago. So I hope you found this type of information to be quite educational. And if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching.